What's the method for extracting ourselves from dissatisfaction in general and too much mental stress in particular? Taking responsibility for the quality of our own lives is the precondition of extracting ourselves. In his last statement to his disciples, the Buddha emphasized the idea that they should live as islands or lamps unto themselves, being their own refuge, and having no one else as their refuge. As he had said previously, quote, "You are master of yourself. What other master could there be? Purity and impurity come from oneself. No one can purify another." End quote. Ultimately, the quality of our lives, our degree of wisdom is up to us. Sages like the Buddha or Jesus are often thought of as healers. The model is the familiar medical one of disease, diagnosis, prognosis, and prescription. The method for extracting ourselves from dissatisfaction in general and too much mental stress in particular is the prescription. Notice that it's the last step of the healing analogy. That analogy begins with apprehension of the disease. What's our human disease? Answering is not a matter of believing some theory about what hurts. Just observe life as it is. When we do that, what do we find? Persistent dissatisfaction, a lack of ease, too much stress. Our experiences are tinged with discomfort. This is not theory, it's fact. Even when we enjoy moments of satisfaction, there's an underlying sadness or regret because we know that they won't last, even when we futilely try to cling to them. For more on testing yourself about this, see Chapter 2 in my Are You Living Without Purpose? If we're fortunate enough not to die young, we understand that what confronts us is illness, old age, and death. Instead of trying to flee either into incessant distractions or fanaticism, unexamined beliefs, and dogmatic assertions, we should inquire into the nature of our dissatisfaction and try to discover for ourselves how to diminish or eliminate it. That's the method that all philosophers advocate. As the Christian theologian Soren Kierkegaard puts it, quote, "In order to swim, one takes off all one's clothes. In order to aspire to the truth, one must undress in a far more inward sense, divest oneself of all one's inward clothes, of thoughts, conceptions, selfishness, and so on, before one is sufficiently naked." End quote. This is a skill that, more than most skills, requires courage. It requires courage to set aside all the familiar opinions to which one clings as a shield against life's troubles. Though simple, detachment is difficult. Not easy. However, it's the key to living well. Fortunately, there are skilled or accomplished people, masters, who have already blazed a trail for us to follow. If we emulate those who have done it, we are able to become unbound from our travails. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha recommends beginning by following the training of a master. Avoid those who discourage you from doing so, and become companions with those who encourage you. The goal, of course, is to master the skills of detachment and unbind yourself. What you'll discover, if you haven't already, is that there are not many genuinely free, unbound, accomplished masters. As the Buddha puts it, quote, "Few are those among the people who cross to the other shore." End quote from the Dhammapada. Those who have crossed to the other shore are, quote, "freed in every respect," end quote. Like a bird gliding through space, such masters glide through life without leaving a trace. Their previously heavy burden of ego, which Wallace correctly calls the haughty pretense of I, me, and mine, is stilled. Accomplished masters enjoy the peacefulness, calmness, serenity, and delight that is the birthright of all of us. What exactly is the diagnosis? What's the difference between the wise and the rest of us? Our lives are poisoned by infatuation, in other words, lust, craving, desire, passion, gain. Hostility, in other words, aversion, hatred. And delusion, or ignorance. The lives of masters are not. The superlative practitioner has walked the way charted by beneficial teachings, become free from infatuation, hostility, and delusion, and lives attentively, with a heart suffused with friendliness, compassion, equanimity, and joy. That's what it is to live well. Until we master life, since we live it daily, we are intimately familiar with the disease, with living less than well. So the diagnosis is that our lives are poisoned by infatuation, hostility, and delusion. Is our prognosis good? Yes, if we follow, after finding, and master beneficial teaching. So, after accepting responsibility for ourselves, our initial critical task is to find beneficial teachings. Where? In a deservedly famous passage, the Buddha points the way. Quote, "You should not be convinced by unconfirmed reports, by tradition, by hearsay, by scriptures, by logical reasoning, by inferential reasoning, by reflection on superficial appearances, by delighting in opinions and speculations, by the appearance of plausibility, or because you think this person is our teacher. When you know for yourselves these teachings are beneficial, these teachings are without fault, these teachings would be approved of by the wise, these teachings, when fully taken up, lead to welfare, to ease, then you should live embracing these teachings." End quote. If so, there are 10 false directions, and the beneficial teachings center around what we can call the method of unbinding. To master the method is to become an accomplished or awakened person, in other words, a sage. Meditation brings wisdom. Lack of meditation leaves ignorance. There can be no wisdom for those who do not meditate. There are different ways to meditate, different ways of executing the method of unbinding. The practice of aliveness awareness in video 9 is one way to practice the method of unbinding. Although it's difficult to master, practicing it is simple, easy, and enjoyable. Any similar practice can be effective. Zazen is one such practice. However, all meditative practices, techniques, methods are ultimately to be dropped. An accomplished, skilled, or awakened master lives beyond them. Living well is beyond trying to live well. Once we are able to do it, there's no more need to try to do it. Infatuation, hostility, and delusion poison our lives. They poison how we think, how we talk, and how we behave. In other words, they poison what we do. That's why we are dissatisfied. The cure is to antidote the poisons. Essentially, this means opening, doing, to being. Once we realize our true nature, since we already are what we need to be, that realization begins to pervade all our doings. It's helpful to understand that there's not anything else we need to do. Fundamentally, in other words, as unpoisoned, we're good. Once we antidote the poisons, each one of us has the ability to enjoy a life of peacefulness and ease. Could there be any better news than that? There's an abundance of fulfillment, completion, salvation already available. For example, not only can mental stress be reduced, it can be wholly eliminated. There's no reason not to drop dreams of future fulfillment. After all, they're just more thoughts. Heaven is possible, here, now. What should we do? Though not easy, it's simple. Eradicate infatuation, hostility, and delusion. How? Find, follow, and master beneficial teachings. This is the way to unbinding and the only way to unbinding. What sense does that make? It depends upon experiencing a distinction between what I call being and becoming. There is no universal agreed upon terminology here. I don't know which terms you prefer. Becoming is the temporal domain of form or the fabricated, whereas being is the non-temporal, eternal domain of the formless or unfabricated. A form is just any limited object that may be singled out. This returns us to the topic or task of understanding yourself. Recall that I suggested that your understanding of yourself is, while not necessarily inaccurate, radically incomplete. That is because you almost certainly identify only with your forms, the physical mental fabrications that has an autobiography. In other words, you routinely and typically think of yourself only as the protagonist in a story, which from your perspective is the story of me. When asked, who are you? How do you answer? You answer with whatever you identify with. In other words, your story. You may think or talk about your parents and relatives. You may think about your birth, your upbringing, your schooling, the people you have loved and who have loved you, your job or career, and so on. Again, that's all true or likely to be mostly true. It's true, let's imagine, that you were born in such and such a location a certain number of years ago and were raised by your parents and so on. Stories require time. There's no such thing as a momentary story. So your story of me is your identification with temporal forms, which are always limited fabrications. What's incomplete about that? To begin to get a sense of what's missing about your understanding of your own nature from the story of me, notice that the past doesn't exist any longer. It's gone. It's not real. Similarly, notice that the future is also non-existent. It doesn't yet exist. It too is not real. Of course, you have lots of memories, lots of thoughts about your past. Still, since the past is not real, set them aside. Similarly, you have lots of thoughts about the future as well, such as plans, dreams, goals, hopes, and so on. Still, since the future is not real, please also set them aside. Since your life still has too much dissatisfaction, you likely think that if it is to occur, genuine fulfillment will occur only in your future, even though that's also where your death is. Now, abstracting from time, ask yourself seriously, who am I? Do not answer by referring to memories, in other words, thoughts about the past. Do not answer by referring to imagined situations in the future, in other words, thoughts about the future. Right here, right now, ask, who am I? Who are you apart from the story you normally identify with? No stories are answers to this question. What's the answer? Who are you without past or future? Who are you now? Of course, you are real. That's not an issue. The issue is who or what you are. What's true about you right now? What is your reality? Let that sink in. Yourself is nothing external to you. It's not somehow out there, so it makes no sense to try to perceive it. What about introspecting in order to find it? That too fails. As Hume famously argued, when he looked inside for his self, he couldn't find it. He found lots of particular objects or forms, which he called perceptions, but he failed to find anything like a continuant substratum that was having them. As Locke earlier admitted, the whole idea of a substratum is unintelligible. Ultimately, it's not experienced. There's nothing in there to be found that could be identified as a self. If you disagree, what is it? Without past or future, the reality is that we are empty of a substratum. That thought may frighten you. You may fear that you are nothing. Not so fast. Recall that dissatisfaction always comes from separation. If you had a substratum, it would always be separate from everything else. And that would mean perpetual dissatisfaction. Therefore, since there is no substratum causing separation, the possibility of living without separation, and so without dissatisfaction, is genuine.